Hey everyone, welcome back to MangaMinute. I'm thrilled to share my latest recap video with you. If you missed the previous one, no worries, just take a quick peek in the description below for the link. Now, let's dive right in and enjoy.
From the window of his second-story room, Doyegang stood in contemplation, his gaze fixed on the streets below. His thoughts were heavy, filled with wistful longing. The simplicity of an ordinary life, one of a lover who could be found anywhere, seemed so far out of reach. He pondered the harshness of reality, weighed down by the impossibility of such dreams. For someone like him, burdened by circumstances, the idea of blending into the mundane felt like a cruel fantasy. Behind him, Sun Yakran approached, her presence quietly persistent, though her words barely registered in his mind. Doyegang's thoughts had already shifted, focusing on Poong Cheon, the source of his recent frustration. That bastard, he mused darkly, forcing me to share a room with this woman. His irritation simmered beneath the surface, yet he said nothing aloud. Sun Yakran's mood, however, soured as she sensed the dismissal. She fumed silently, her thoughts boiling over with annoyance. The late hour weighed on her, the stress of it threatening to mar her pristine skin, something she clearly wouldn't forgive easily. And in her mind, the blame for her inconvenience would certainly fall on Doyegang's shoulders. With a heavy sigh of resignation, Doyegang rose from his seat, his movements slow and reluctant, as if surrendering to an unavoidable chore. He had no energy left to argue, not tonight. He waved her off, allowing her to retreat to her rest. But as he shifted from his spot, something unexpected and swift interrupted the quiet. A sudden hiss sliced through the air. An arrow, released with deadly intent, flew into the room. By sheer chance, Doyegang's movement saved him. The arrow embedded itself in the wall where he had just been sitting. Both he and Sun Yakran froze in shock, their instincts kicking in moments later. They turned as one, eyes locking on the projectile now stuck in the wall behind them. The brief stillness shattered as more arrows followed, raining into the room with merciless precision. Hyuk Samsu's assassin team had struck. Doyegang and Sun Yakran scrambled, each dodging with practiced agility, their bodies moving reflexively to evade the deadly assault. The peaceful night had become a battleground in an instant, the once serene room now a chaotic dance of survival. Sun Yakran's heart raced as the arrows pierced the air around her. The shock of the attack had barely worn off when her frustration boiled over. The near-death experience left her breathless and seething, eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and fury. Her mind raced, wondering what could have brought such danger to their doorstep, her gaze settling accusingly on Doyegang. His silence amid the chaos only served to amplify her exasperation, as if he had somehow caused this, drawing death to their door. Before she could voice her thoughts further, the door to the room burst open, and Poong Cheon rushed in, his face pale but determined. His concern for Doyegang was evident in his hurried movements as he assessed the situation. Yet, despite the flurry of arrows and the danger hanging in the air, Doyegang remained composed. His response was curt, revealing nothing of the turmoil that briefly flickered across his mind. He was unharmed, though the arrows had come dangerously close. Without hesitation, Doyegang issued a firm order, his voice steady and commanding. Poong Cheon, ever the loyal subordinate, bowed deeply in acknowledgement, his movements swift and resolute. There was no time for hesitation, and the gravity of the situation called for immediate action. In a fluid motion, Poong Cheon struck Doyegang's pressure points, ensuring he became immobilized. Then, without delay, he pulled Doyegang with him, leading the way to confront the enemies that lurked in the shadows. As Poong Cheon pulled Doyegang along with determined haste, the latter's irritation became increasingly evident. His thoughts raced, filled with exasperation at the absurdity of the situation. He had given a clear command to subdue the enemies, yet now found himself being dragged into the heart of danger. His mind bristled at the contradiction. How could this possibly be the best course of action? Poong Cheon, however, was resolute, his protective instincts outweighing any logic. He could not, and would not, leave Doyegang behind in a place where arrows flew so freely, where the threat of death loomed in every corner. To him, bringing Doyegang into the fray seemed the safer option. Better to fight with him at his side than to leave him exposed and vulnerable. But Doyegang's frustration only deepened. The thought of being taken straight into the enemy's path grated on his nerves. his mind filled with disbelief at Poong Cheon's misplaced sense of protection. Was he truly safer in the midst of enemy territory? The absurdity of it gnawed at him, yet there was no time for argument. The situation was dire, and they both knew it. Meanwhile, back in the room, Sun Yakran stood alone, her pulse still racing from the close encounter with death. As she watched them leave, panic gripped her. The silence left in their wake felt suffocating, and the reality of being abandoned in such a precarious moment hit her like a wave. As Poong Cheon confronted the enemies, his movements were sharp and precise, honed by years of training. Each swing of his sword was deliberate, cutting through the ranks of assassins with deadly efficiency. One by one, the enemies fell before him, their attempts to resist futile against his skill. His focus never wavered, his form a calculated dance of lethal intent. Amid the chaos, the assassins regrouped, their leader barking orders. The plan was simple: lure Poong Cheon away, far from the sect's young leader, so that Hyuk Sim-soo could execute the final part of their scheme unhindered. Yet, as Poong Cheon advanced with terrifying speed, the assassins' confidence began to falter. Their eyes widened in disbelief as they realized the young sect leader was not where they had expected him to be. Safely tucked away, an easy target for capture. Instead, Doyegang was right there, being dragged along with Poong Cheon into the thick of battle. The sight was enough to unsettle even the most hardened of the assassins. Confusion flickered across their faces as the young sect leader, far from being isolated and vulnerable, was in the very heart of the confrontation. What they had planned so meticulously now seemed a far-fetched scenario. Hyuk Sim-soo arrived at the room where Doyegang was supposed to be, flanked by the Inyong twin demons. His eyes scanned the empty space, expecting to find his target, but instead, only Sun Yakran stood there, a smirk playing on her lips. Disbelief washed over him as he realized the truth. Doyegang had escaped, taken by Poong Cheon before he could be captured. The weight of failure settled on Hyuk Sim-soo's shoulders. His plan had crumbled before him. His mind raced, recalling his uncle's stern warning, one that left no room for error. This mission had been crucial, and now, with Doyegang gone, the consequences would be severe. Failure was not an option. It would never be tolerated. His thoughts turned grim as he processed the full scope of his predicament. The Inyong twin demons, sensing the gravity of the situation, exchanged a glance. Without a word, they moved towards the window, instinctively planning their escape. If the mission had failed, perhaps survival would be found in fleeing before the repercussions caught up with them. But Hyuk Sim-soo was faster. His eyes darkened, a cruel finality creeping into his expression. There would be no running away from this. With swift precision, he unleashed a flurry of poison-tipped needles at his subordinates, the projectiles finding their marks with deadly accuracy. The Inyong twin demons crumpled to the floor, their escape cut short by their own master. Hyuk Sim-soo gazed down at their lifeless bodies, a bitter resolve hardening within him. Everyone was as good as dead, he realized. There was no escaping the wrath of his uncle for this failure. With cold acceptance, he made his final decision. He drew a needle and turned it on himself, allowing the venom to take hold, choosing death over the inevitable wrath that awaited him. The silence that followed was heavy, the room now filled only with the lifeless forms of those who had failed in their mission. Sun Yakran stood frozen for a moment, her eyes wide with disbelief as she took in the aftermath of Hyuk Sim-soo's sudden and brutal actions. The room had fallen eerily silent, the lifeless bodies of the assassins sprawled across the floor, their fates sealed in a matter of seconds. It all felt surreal, like some twisted nightmare. She hesitated before moving, her mind racing to catch up with the reality before her. Slowly, she approached the bodies, her steps tentative, as though expecting them to spring back to life at any moment. But there was no movement, only the stillness of death. Kneeling beside them, she checked for any signs of life, but it was clear. Hyuk Sim-soo and the Inyong twin demons were gone. A wave of incredulity washed over her. They were really dead. She blinked in disbelief, trying to comprehend how it had come to this. How could they have thrown their lives away so carelessly? As Doyegang entered the room, freed from the pressure points that had restrained his movement, his thoughts were a mix of exhaustion and frustration. He glanced at Poong Cheon, the tension clear in his expression. The night had already been chaotic enough, and now this. His voice dripped with exasperation. silently accusing Poong Cheon of dragging him into an even bloodier confrontation than necessary. But as his gaze shifted around the room, his irritation was quickly replaced by shock. 3 bodies lay motionless on the floor, the air thick with the scent of death. Doyegang froze for a moment, eyes widening as he processed the scene. His mind raced with questions, and an uneasy realization crept over him. These weren't just any enemies, they were figures he recognized. Poong Cheon moved swiftly, inspecting the corpses with a practiced eye. His brow furrowed as he identified them. Hyuk Sim-soo, the dangerous assassin leader, lay dead alongside the infamous In-young twin demons. The sight left little room for doubt. Somehow, in the brief time Doyegang had been away, the situation had spiraled into something far darker. Doyegang's thoughts turned to Sun Yakran, who stood quietly in the room, watching the scene unfold. His voice softened in confusion, his mind struggling to piece together the events. What could have possibly happened in his absence? Sun Yakran, seemingly unfazed by the carnage, recounted the events. She hadn't lifted a finger, she explained. It had all been Hyuk Sim-soo's doing. Haunted by the weight of failure, the assassin had turned on his own men, killing the twins before ending his own life in an act of grim desperation. Doyegang's eyes narrowed, his voice edged with disbelief as he processed Sun Yakran's survival amidst the chaos. The thought of Hyuk Sim-soo's suicide weighed heavily on his mind, but what puzzled him more was how she remained unscathed in a room filled with death. His gaze shifted toward her, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Sun Yakran, clearly irritated by his skepticism, fired back. Her frustration bubbled to the surface as she reminded him of the reckless decision to leave her behind. The room had been a danger zone, and yet she had been abandoned, left to fend for herself in the face of assassins and bloodshed. Her voice sharpened as she turned her scolding toward Poong Cheon, the man who had dragged Doyegang away without a second thought for her safety. The threat in her words was clear. One day, she promised, she would make him pay for it. But Poong Cheon, seemingly unbothered by her anger, moved with calm efficiency. Ignoring her outburst, he retrieved a small bottle from within his robes, a practiced gesture that hinted at familiarity with such grim tasks. Without hesitation, he uncapped the bottle and dripped a strange liquid onto the bodies of the dead assassins. In an instant, the corpses began to dissolve, leaving no trace of their existence on the floor. The clean, efficient erasure of life left even Sun Yakran momentarily speechless. For a moment, the room fell silent, the shock of the disappearing bodies momentarily overriding the tension. Sun Yakran's gaze lingered on the floor where the corpses had once been, her irritation fading into awe at the sight. The power to dissolve bodies so effortlessly was both impressive and terrifying, but for Poong Cheon, it seemed routine. With the bodies dealt with, Poong Cheon spoke, his tone pragmatic. The room was no longer safe and they needed to leave. Doyegang, finally breaking from his thoughts, agreed. There was no time to dwell on what had happened. They had barely escaped with their lives, and danger still loomed outside. The night was far from over. As the carriage bumped along the uneven road, the tension inside was thick, though it was Sun Yakran's voice that broke the silence, dripping with sarcasm. The events of the past days had worn on her patience, and she made no effort to hide it. Life in the martial world was unpredictable, dangerous, and often exhausting. Something she pointed out with biting humor, likening it to constantly having one's neck twisted. The relentless 4-day journey had taken its toll, and now, she complained about the stench of sweat and grime clinging to her, casting a side glance at Poong Cheon as if blaming him for the whole ordeal. The suggestion of squeezing the oil out of Doyegang's head was made with mockery, yet her frustration was real. Doyegang, on the other hand, was lost in his thoughts. His mind wandered over the events that had unfolded. He hadn't paid much attention to his own state until now, but the discomfort of the last few days had finally caught up with him. His clothes stuck to his skin, and he could feel the layer of dust and sweat that had accumulated. It wasn't just the weariness of battle but the grime of travel. He felt particularly unclean, and the need for some semblance of relief gnawed at him. Without much deliberation, Doyegang gave a command. They would stop at the next stream they passed. It was an order meant to restore some small comfort in the midst of the chaos, but Poong Cheon, ever the steadfast guardian, refused. His response was firm, denying the request with a tone that left no room for argument. This journey, after all, wasn't about comfort. Endurance was necessary, and Poong Cheon was determined to see that his young master embraced the harsh reality of their circumstances. Doyegang, filled with frustration, pressed forward in his demand, his voice sharp and commanding. The open air seemed to fuel his agitation, and he was determined to put an end to the situation. His orders came swiftly, expecting immediate compliance. However, before he could finish his command, Poong Cheon, on high alert, abruptly shouted, cutting through the tension with a tone of urgency. Startled by the sudden shift, Doyegang's thoughts raced. The situation had changed in an instant, leaving him uncertain. He quickly stepped out of the carriage, his mind racing with questions. The suddenness of Poong Cheon's alert put him on edge, and he moved swiftly to assess the unfolding situation. A man stood in the middle of the road, waving down the approaching carriage with an air of urgency. Introducing himself as Sang Pil-woong, he explained that he ran a military office in the Seoan region. His carriage wheel had broken while he was tending to a young lady, and now he found himself stranded. His request for help seemed simple enough, but Doyegang's mind raced as he observed the stranger. The man's internal energy was weak, almost pathetic in comparison to any formidable martial artist. Doyegang quickly surmised that Sang Pil-woong was likely affiliated with a third-rate military office, unworthy of serious concern. Without hesitation, Doyegang issued orders to assist the man, though his thoughts remained dismissive of Sang Pil-woong's capabilities. Poong Cheon, ever obedient yet ruthless in his own way, followed through, but in a manner that startled everyone. He effortlessly lifted the broken carriage and, without a second thought, hurled it over the cliffside as though it were nothing more than a trivial object. His booming voice made it clear to Sang Pil-woong that any further assistance was out of the question, leaving the man with no choice but to seek help elsewhere. Doyegang, witnessing the scene, felt a wave of panic rise within him. Inwardly, he cursed Poong Cheon's brash actions, his thoughts filled with exasperation. The situation had taken an unexpected turn. Poong Cheon's actions were far from what he'd intended, and Doyegang couldn't help but wonder what trouble might follow due to Poong Cheon's reckless handling of the matter. The man, still shaken by Poong Cheon's earlier display of strength, hesitantly asked if they could at least be offered a ride. Doyegang, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation, agreed without hesitation. He invited them to join Poong Cheon in the coach seat, hoping to move things along smoothly. The young lady accompanying the man, Ju Seol-bin, bowed gracefully as she introduced herself, expressing gratitude for their kindness. Poong Cheon, maintaining his stoic demeanor, opened the carriage door for her, gesturing for her to enter first. As Ju Seol-bin stepped into the carriage, her gaze immediately fell upon an unsettling sight. Inside, sitting calmly, was Sun Yakran, her neck twisted grotesquely at an unnatural angle, turned a full 180 degrees. The shock of the scene caused Ju Seol-bin to freeze momentarily, her breath catching in her throat. Sensing her alarm, Doyegang quickly reassured her, though the sight was undoubtedly strange. He calmly explained that Sun Yakran, despite appearances, was human, though that did little to alleviate the unsettling atmosphere inside the cramped carriage. Inside the carriage, Sun Yakran's attention quickly turned to Ju Seol-bin. Her gaze lingered on the young woman as she broke the silence with a teasing comment about her appearance, noting how pretty she was and asking if she had ever made men cry. Ju Seol-bin, still unsettled by the eerie atmosphere, responded quietly, her tone cautious. Not satisfied, Sun Yakran pressed further, hinting at her assumption that Ju Seol-bin came from a noble background based on her escort. But once again, Ju Seol-bin's response was brief and understated, denying the assumption. Growing impatient with the timid replies, Sun Yakran's tone shifted, laced with irritation. She found Ju Seol-bin's lack of engagement disappointing, labeling her fearful and dull, the conversation now a source of frustration for her. Ju Seol-bin, still unnerved by Sun Yakran's unsettling appearance with her twisted neck, tried to manage her rising fear. The tension in the carriage was suffocating, and the bizarre situation left her scrambling for a way to break the awkwardness. An idea suddenly came to her. She closed her eyes briefly and sent a telepathic message to Doyegang, addressing him directly as the young sect leader. The unexpected message startled Doyegang, sending a wave of shock through him. His thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. This woman, he thought, his mind immediately jumping to suspicion. Is she part of the assassination team sent by the demonic cult? The revelation that Ju Seol-bin possessed telepathic abilities added a layer of complexity to an already precarious situation. As if reading his suspicions, Ju Seol-bin continued her telepathic communication, asking him to promise he wouldn't make a sound, no matter what she said next. Doyagang's mind remained sharp, his thoughts circling back to the demonic cult. What could their intentions be? He pondered, still unsure whether this woman posed a threat or if she was playing a deeper game. Suspicion lingered in the air between them as the silent exchange carried on.